My 2022 Inktober challenge is to draw local native plants, and in order to do that, I need to research to find out what they are and if they're native. In this video, I'll explain my process for identifying my local plants and share the apps I use, as well as go through the benefits of researching as part of your nature journaling practice. G'day everyone, welcome back to part 4 of my Inktober process for the challenge this year. In part 1, I shared how I use nature journaling to study a subject, then my inking process in part 2, and in the last video I discussed how to deal with decision paralysis. Links are in the description if you want to check them out. In this part, I'll explain how I research my subjects, from identifying them to learning interesting facts, while providing data to the scientific community. So in parts 1 and 2, I focused on this tree, which I had a pretty good idea was a wattle from its golden flowers. However, there's over 1,300 species of acacia, and over 1,000 of them are Australian. I need to know if this one's native, and if I could narrow down the species at all. So before I walk you through how I answered these questions and did the research, let's talk about what research is and why I do it. Research might sound like homework, but the golden rule is if you find it interesting and not a chore, then it's not homework. I also want to make a point here about the difference between searching and researching. Researching is a little bit more involved than searching. So searching, for example, is where are my keys? You can type into Google and say, what's the airspeed velocity of an unladen swallow? You're not really interested in learning anything, seeking knowledge or truth, which is what researching is. It involves analysing, learning something, making checks, and so on. I don't research absolutely everything because otherwise I'd probably stop doing it altogether since I wouldn't enjoy it anymore. Part of the power of nature journaling is that you naturally find your subject more interesting as you pay attention to it, and from there it's no big leap to want to learn more about it. So I'm happy to do a little bit of research, just not hours and hours, to find out what the trees and plants are next time I walk around my neighbourhood, and that will help me feel more connected to where I live. What drives my curiosity is learning more about the world I live in, and sharing that information and knowledge with others. Researching a subject benefits me personally, but if I share the information I collect, then it benefits the greater community too. I believe an important part of nature journaling is the scientific aspect of it for this reason. It's very easy to contribute, and you don't need to be an expert. So let's have a look now at how I did this process for the first day of my Inktober challenge, which was the wattle. Okay, to start, I took photos of different features that I thought would be useful for identifying, such as the habitat that the plant's in, the leaves or the foliage, the flowers, and the bark. And later on, I uploaded them to an app called iNaturalist. I found this the most useful and accurate app. I have tried others such as Google Lens or Seek, which is actually by iNaturalist, but they don't seem to do as good a job at suggesting what I'm looking at. So the reason why I think iNaturalist is so powerful and accurate at its suggestions is because they're based on visual similarities as well as location. Once you've uploaded the photos and put in metadata such as location and the date, which sometimes is done automatically depending on your camera, your phone, if it has that data embedded with the photographs, then you can go to what is this, and it will give you suggestions, or you can type it in straight away if you think you know the answer. So then it's a question of going through the suggestions and comparing my photos and my observations from my nature journaling with the suggested species and pick the one I think matches best. Now, if I'm not sure at all, I might go higher up the tree of life, back to the family, for example, until I'm sure. Once you think you've got something close, you can select that, and other people in the community can then offer their suggested IDs and help narrow down what you actually have found. It can take some time for others to suggest their IDs, so in the meantime, you could keep researching yourself. You could also go into the Explore tab, and if you know that it's an acacia, then search acacia in your location. I'm lucky in that by narrowing it down just to the acacia in Mandurah, there are 6 species that are suggested, so I can have a closer look at them. Now the first one's Prickly Moses. I've seen this one around, but the leaves are much smaller than the one I found here. Next is the Golden Wreath Wattle, and based on the photos and everything, it's actually a strong contender. Then there's the western coastal wattle, and it looks similar. However, I've previously nature journaled this one for its red-eyed seed pods, and I didn't notice them on this tree. So I made a mental note to go back and compare them, and noticed that the leaves looked different and it wasn't flowering, and there was definitely evidence of those seed pods from previous flowering. So I don't think that the one that I nature journaled for Inktober is this species. Then there's the rigid wattle, and the leaves look a bit different where they attach, and I wouldn't really say that the leaves on my species are rigid. The narrow-winged wattle looks very different. And finally, the Acacia rostolifera, which again is a strong contender, but there wasn't very much info. Looking it up a bit later on Wikipedia, I found out that it's called the summer-scented wattle. I haven't noticed the strong smell, and I don't know if this could be it or not based on the information that I've got. So I think what I'll do is put in golden wreath and see what the community thinks. So I mentioned iNaturalist, Seek and Google Lens as 3 apps that I use, with iNaturalist being my go-to one. Seek by iNaturalist is a family-friendly version. It's also gamified with badges and challenges, so that might make it more fun for children, for families. Google Lens in my default Android camera app is great, but I don't think it's very accurate. So it's quite fast at analysing a photo that you take and giving suggestions. This might help me, for example, at least identify the family. So it's good for a starting point sometimes. Of course, you could always have a field guide with you rather than an app. So for example, I have been starting to collect these bush books. So they're great for narrowing down your relevant species in a manual search method, but at least it gets rid of everything else around the world that might not be relevant. Quest-A-Game is one that was developed in Australia, and it gamifies it, so it's good for families. eBird is another one that focuses on birds, and its data comes from the Cornell Lab of Ornithology. And for example, recently I used the BirdLife Australia app for last week's Aussie bird count. Remember, even if you aren't an expert, sharing your data is still useful, especially in Australia, where there's still so much unknown about our environment. Paula Peters, who worked in wildlife conservation in Australia for 13 years, wrote recently that this is a really important and worthwhile thing to do, because very little is known about the vast majority of Australian species, where they live, how many there are, what time of year they breed, etc. We need this basic observational data to inform how we look after our wildlife. So I hope you've enjoyed watching and learning about my process, and if you found it valuable, please remember to give this video a like. Let me know in the comments what makes you curious when you're nature journaling. For more nature journaling adventures, remember to subscribe to my channel if you haven't already. Next week, I will be sharing the final flip through of my Inktober series pages. I hope you've enjoyed the series, and thank you for watching to the end. I really appreciate it. And I'll see you all next week.